The African slave trade, a brutal exchange of human lives. Listen. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the African slave trade, was one of the darkest periods in human history. Millions of Africans were brutally taken from their homes and forced into slavery, enduring unimaginable horrors at the hands of European colonizers. However, what is often forgotten or ignored is the fact that Africans were not solely victims in this trade, they were also active participants. Contrary to popular belief, Africans were not kidnapped or stolen by white Americans. They were traded and sold by other Africans. This fact has been used to downplay the role of Europeans in the slave trade and shift blame onto Africans. But does this excuse the treatment of enslaved Africans in the United States and their descendants? Absolutely not. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century when European nations started to colonize the Americas. To meet the high demand for cheap labor, Europeans turned to Africa, a continent rich in resources and people. However, it's important to note that the practice of slavery already existed in Africa, but it was vastly different from the brutal system imposed by Europeans. In pre-colonial Africa, slavery was often a form of punishment for crimes or a way to repay debts. Enslaved individuals still had certain rights and could eventually earn their freedom. It was not a hereditary system, and children born to enslaved parents were not automatically enslaved themselves. This is vastly different from the chattel slavery that was practiced in the Americas, where enslaved people were considered property and had no rights or freedom. With the arrival of European colonizers, the demand for cheap labor increased exponentially. This led to an increase in the already existing intra-African slave trade, where powerful African kingdoms would raid smaller villages and sell captured individuals to European traders. These traders would then transport them across the Atlantic to be sold as slaves in the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade lasted for over 400 years and resulted in the forced migration of 12 to 15 million Africans to the Americas. The conditions on the transatlantic slave ships were inhumane, with enslaved people packed tightly together in unsanitary conditions, leading to the spread of diseases and deaths during the journey. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were treated as property, subjected to backbreaking labor and brutal punishments. The argument that Africans were responsible for their own enslavement is often used to justify the actions of European colonizers and shift responsibility away from them. However, this ignores the fact that African kingdoms did not have the same level of power as European nations. They were often forced into trade agreements with Europeans through violence and coercion. Furthermore, it ignores the long-lasting effects of slavery on African descendants. Even after the abolition of slavery in the United States, African Americans continued to face systemic racism and discrimination. The legacy of slavery still lingers today in the form of economic disparities, mass incarceration, and ongoing racial tensions. This is not a result of Africans selling their own people, but rather the lasting impact of a brutal system that dehumanized and oppressed an entire race of people. It's also important to acknowledge that while some Africans may have participated in the slave trade, many others actively resisted it. Revolts on slave ships and plantations were common, and there were also individuals who risked their lives to help enslaved people escape to freedom. In addition, many African societies had their own forms of resistance to the slave trade, such as refusing to participate in trade agreements or hiding and protecting those who escaped from enslavement. These acts of resistance highlight the agency and resilience of Africans in the face of oppression. In conclusion, the African slave trade was a brutal exchange of human lives, with both Europeans and Africans playing a role. While it is important to acknowledge the involvement of Africans in the trade, it does not excuse or justify the treatment of enslaved Africans in the United States and their descendants. It is crucial that we continue to educate ourselves and others about the true history of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting effects on African descendants today. Only then can we move towards healing and reconciliation. KIK, knowledge is king. Get into the know. Please like and share this video. Thanks for watching.